The rain struck Clara's face like ice needles as she stumbled through the cafe's back door. Her grandmother's shawl clutched against her chest, where something warm and frighteningly still pressed against her heartbeat. The infant's skin felt cold as marble, translucent enough that she could see dark veins beneath, and when those tiny eyelids fluttered open, crimson light spilled out like liquid fire in the storm's darkness. She had found him 20 minutes ago, abandoned beside the dumpster in a cardboard box that disintegrated under the torrential downpour. No blanket, no note. Just a baby who should have been screaming from cold and abandonment, but lay silent, watching her with those impossible eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. When she lifted him, his fingers had curled around her thumb with surprising strength, and something deep in her chest had shifted, a maternal instinct she never knew existed roaring to life, despite the strangeness of his appearance. Clara pushed through the cafe's kitchen door, dripping rainwater across the worn linoleum as she cradled the child closer. Her grandmother's voice drifted from the front room, humming an ancient melody that had been passed down through generations of women in their family, a lullaby that somehow felt heavier tonight, more significant. The baby's crimson eyes fixed on Clara's face, and she felt an odd pull, as if invisible threads were weaving themselves between them with each shared breath. "Abuela, I need help," Clara called softly, not wanting to startle either the elderly woman or the strange infant in her arms. But as she stepped into the dining area, her words died in her throat. Her grandmother sat frozen in her wheelchair, her weathered hands gripping the armrests, staring at something behind Clara with an expression of terror and recognition that made Clara's blood turn to ice. She turned slowly, still protecting the baby against her chest, and found herself face to face with a figure that seemed to absorb the cafe's warm light. The man stood over 6 feet tall, his pale skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, and when he moved, shadows moved with him like living things. His eyes held the same crimson glow as the infant's, but where the baby's gaze seemed curious and trusting, this man's burned with barely contained fury and something that might have been grief. "Give him to me," the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent that spoke of old centuries and forgotten kingdoms. His gaze never left the child in Clara's arms, but she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her ribs. "You do not understand what you hold, mortal." Clara's arms tightened protectively around the baby, who had begun to make soft cooing sounds against her neck. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her grandmother's wheelchair blocked one exit, and this creature stood between her and the door. More than that, the infant's tiny fingers had wound themselves into the fabric of her uniform, clinging with desperate trust that made her heart ache. "I understand he was dying in the rain," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I understand he's just a baby who needed help." The stranger's eyes widened, and for a moment something raw and vulnerable flickered across his features before the mask of controlled anger slammed back into place. He took a step forward, and Clara noticed that his reflection didn't appear in the cafe's rain-streaked windows, that the fluorescent lights seemed to dim in his presence. "You know nothing of what he needs," the man said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. His gaze dropped to the baby, and Clara saw his entire body tense. "Show me his wrist." Without thinking, Clara adjusted her hold on the infant, revealing the tiny arm where a mark pulsed beneath the translucent skin. It looked like a crown intersected by a crescent moon, glowing faintly with the same crimson light as the baby's eyes. The stranger's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the suddenly silent cafe. "My son," he whispered, and the words carried such weight of pain and relief that Clara felt tears prick her own eyes. "My heir." The baby turned his head toward the man's voice, those ancient eyes studying the stranger with what Clara could only describe as polite interest, but he made no move to reach for him. Instead, the infant's grip on Clara's shirt tightened, and he nestled deeper against her warmth. The rejection was subtle but unmistakable, and Clara watched the stranger's face crumble with an anguish so profound it made her chest ache in sympathy. "He doesn't know you," Clara said gently, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The stranger's crimson gaze snapped to her face, and she felt exposed, as if he could read every thought behind her eyes. "He is mine by blood and birthright," the man said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I am Lucian, king of the Northern Territories, lord of the Night Court. This child is my only heir, stolen from my castle 3 days ago by enemies who sought to use him against me." Clara looked down at the baby, who had begun to fuss softly, his tiny face scrunching with discomfort. Without thinking, she started to hum the lullaby her grandmother had taught her, the same melody that had been drifting through the cafe when Lucian arrived. The effect was immediate and startling. The baby's fussing stopped, his crimson eyes growing heavy with contentment, and he relaxed completely against Clara's chest. But it was Lucian's reaction that made Clara's breath catch. The vampire king had gone completely still, his face pale as snow, staring at Clara as if she had just performed some impossible miracle. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother taught it to me," Clara said, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "Her grandmother taught it to her. It's just an old lullaby." "That melody," Lucian said slowly, "is known only to the royal house. It has been sung to our children for over 1,000 years, passed down through bloodlines that predate your civilization. No human should know those notes." Clara's grandmother spoke for the first time since Lucian's arrival, her voice thin but clear. "My great-grandmother worked in a great house, long ago, before the walls went up between our kinds. She said the lady of the manor taught her that song when she had to care for the master's child." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Lucian's eyes moved between Clara and her grandmother, some internal calculation working behind his crimson gaze. The baby in Clara's arms had fallen asleep, his breathing soft and even against her neck, completely trusting in her protection despite being surrounded by tension he couldn't possibly understand. "You saved him," Lucian said finally, and Clara heard something like wonder in his voice. "In 3 days of searching he has taken nothing, accepted nothing. My own court could not calm him, yet you—" He gestured helplessly at the sleeping infant. "I just did what anyone would do," Clara said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. The baby was clearly something far from human, and most people would have run screaming or called the authorities. Instead, she had wrapped him in her grandmother's shawl and brought him inside, driven by an instinct she couldn't name or explain. Lucian stepped closer, moving with fluid grace that made Clara's pulse quicken with fear, and something else she didn't want to examine. When he was close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weight of centuries written in his features, he reached out slowly toward the sleeping child. The baby's eyes snapped open at the approach of those pale fingers, crimson light flaring briefly before settling into watchful alertness. He looked at Lucian for a long moment, then deliberately turned his face back toward Clara's neck, one tiny hand patting her collarbone as if to reassure himself that she was still there. The rejection hit Lucian like a physical blow. Clara watched him step back, his expression carefully blank, but she could see the hurt beneath the controlled mask. This ancient, powerful creature was being dismissed by his own child in favor of a struggling waitress, and the pain of it was written in every line of his body. "Perhaps," Clara said carefully, "he just needs time." The baby's dismissal of his own father hung in the air like a blade, but before anyone could process its full weight, the cafe's front door exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Clara's scream died in her throat as 3 figures materialized from the storm, their forms wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour the cafe's warm light. The leader wore armor that gleamed like black ice, his face a mask of cold fury beneath a crown of thorns, while behind him stood a woman whose beauty was as sharp and deadly as winter frost. Commander Thorne. Lucian's voice cut through the chaos, each syllable dripping with lethal authority. You dare enter human territory without my consent? The armored figure laughed, a sound like breaking stone. Your consent became meaningless the moment you allowed that creature to corrupt our prince. His burning gaze fixed on Clara, who pressed the baby closer to her chest, feeling the infant's tiny heart racing against her ribs. 3 days we tracked the child's scent, only to find him in the arms of mortal filth. Clara's grandmother had begun whispering prayers in Spanish, her weathered hands clutching the rosary at her throat. The baby stirred against Clara's shoulder, his crimson eyes opening to survey the intruders with an alertness that seemed far too knowing for an infant. When his gaze met Commander Thorne's, the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. The child belongs in his rightful place, the woman spoke, her voice like poisoned honey. Lady Evangeline of the Winter Court has come to ensure proper bloodline preservation. She stepped forward, her movements predatory and precise. This human contamination ends now. Lucian positioned himself between the intruders and Clara, his form seeming to expand with barely contained power. You forget yourselves. I am still your king, and this mortal saved my son when your incompetence allowed him to be taken. A king who kneels before human sentiment, Thorne spat. Look at him, Lucian. Your heir clings to this peasant girl while rejecting his own blood. She has bewitched him with whatever foul magic her kind possesses. Clara felt the baby's grip tighten on her shirt, his tiny fingers twisting the fabric as if anchoring himself to her. The mark on his wrist pulsed brighter, and she could swear she felt warmth spreading from where his skin touched hers. He's not bewitched, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He's scared. It speaks? Lady Evangeline laughed, the sound like ice cracking. Tell me, little mortal, do you understand what you hold? That child is the key to our kingdom's future, bred from bloodlines that stretch back to the first darkness. His power, once awakened, could reshape the very fabric between our worlds. The baby began to fuss, sensing the hostility that filled the small cafe. Clara started humming the ancient lullaby instinctively, and the effect was immediate. The infant calmed, nuzzling deeper against her neck, but the reaction from the court members was explosive. Thorne's hand flew to his sword, while Evangeline hissed like an angry cat. Impossible, Evangeline breathed. No human tongue should know the blood lullaby. Yet she sings it as if born to it, Lucian said quietly, his eyes never leaving his son's peaceful face. Perhaps the bloodlines are not as pure as we believed. Perhaps the walls between our kinds were built on foundations of sand. Thorne drew his blade in one fluid motion, the metal singing as it caught the stormlight. Then we tear down those walls entirely, starting with this abomination. He lunged forward, moving faster than Clara's human eyes could track, but Lucian was there, intercepting the strike with his bare hands. The clash of supernatural forces shattered every window in the cafe, sending glass raining down like deadly snow. Clara threw herself over the baby, shielding him with her body as the two ancient beings grappled with inhuman strength. Her grandmother's wheelchair skidded across the floor from the force of their impact, and the elderly woman cried out in terror. The baby began to wail, his cries high and piercing, and the mark on his wrist flared like a tiny star. Enough! Evangeline's voice cut through the chaos. Kill the girl and take the child. The corruption ends here. Clara looked up to see the vampire lady advancing with deadly grace, her fingernails extending into razor-sharp claws. Terror flooded Clara's system, but beneath it burned something fiercer, more primal. This creature threatened the baby she held, the helpless infant who had trusted her with his very life. Without conscious thought, she found herself on her feet, backing toward the kitchen with the child pressed against her chest. Stay away from him, Clara warned, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Evangeline smiled, revealing fangs like ivory daggers. Brave little human. Do you think your courage will save you? Do you think your mortal love means anything against centuries of breeding and power? She raised her claws, preparing to strike. The baby's wails intensified, and something shifted in the air around them. The lights flickered, and Clara felt a strange tingling where the infant's skin touched hers, as if electricity were building beneath his translucent flesh. His crimson eyes blazed brighter, and the mark on his wrist began to pulse in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. Lucian broke free from Thorn's attack, blood streaming from cuts across his pale cheek, and turned to see Evangeline poised to strike Clara down. His roar of fury shook the cafe's foundations, but he was too far away, still tangled with the commander who seemed determined to delay him. Clara saw death approaching in Evangeline's beautiful, terrible face, and made a choice that surprised even her. Instead of running, she stepped forward, placing herself deliberately between the vampire and the baby, using her body as a shield. "If you want him, you go through me first." Evangeline's laugh was like breaking glass. "Gladly." The claws descended in a silver arc, aimed at Clara's heart. But at the last moment, the baby in her arms erupted with light. Crimson energy poured from his tiny form, creating a dome of protection that sent Evangeline flying backward into the cafe's far wall with bone-crushing force. The shockwave knocked Clara to her knees, but the baby remained unharmed in her arms, his power wrapping around them both like a cocoon of safety. Thorn and Lucian froze, staring at the display of raw power emanating from the infant. The commander's face had gone pale with something that might have been fear, while Lucian's expression shifted from fury to awe. The baby's wails had stopped, replaced by an eerie calm, but his eyes continued to blaze with that ancient light. "Impossible," Thorn whispered. "He's too young. The awakening shouldn't happen for decades." "Love," Lucian said softly, his voice filled with wonder as he looked at Clara cradling his son within the dome of protective energy. "She loves him, and he loves her in return. That bond, it's accelerating his development." Evangeline picked herself up from the wreckage of shattered wood and plaster, her perfect features marred by cuts and fury. "Then we kill her quickly, before the corruption spreads further." But as she prepared for another attack, new sounds echoed from outside. The storm had intensified, but beneath the howling wind came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many of them, accompanied by battle cries that made the cafe's remaining glass tremble. Through the shattered door, Clara glimpsed torches moving through the darkness, carried by riders whose eyes glowed like coals in the night. "The rest of the court," Thorn said grimly. "They followed our trail." Lucian's face hardened into a mask of cold determination. "They seek civil war, then they shall have it." He turned to Clara, who still knelt within the baby's protective dome, her arms wrapped around the infant who had somehow claimed her heart completely. "Can you travel?" Clara looked down at the baby, who gazed back at her with trust so complete it made her chest ache. His tiny hand rested against her throat, and she could feel his pulse synchronizing with hers, their heartbeats falling into rhythm. Whatever was happening between them, whatever impossible bond had formed in these chaotic moments, she knew she couldn't abandon him now. "Where?" she asked, surprised by her own calm. "Somewhere safe," Lucian said, but his eyes held doubt. "Though I begin to wonder if such a place exists anymore." The riders outside had surrounded the cafe, their torches creating a ring of flickering light in the storm-lashed darkness. Clara could hear voices calling in languages she didn't recognize, ancient words that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with power. The baby stirred in her arms, his protective dome flickering as his energy began to fade. "They're preparing for a siege," Evangeline said, her smile returning despite her injuries. "And when that barrier falls, the human dies." Clara felt the dome of energy weakening around them, saw the crimson light beginning to fade from the baby's eyes as exhaustion overtook his small form. Whatever power he possessed, maintaining their protection was draining him rapidly. His tiny eyelids fluttered, fighting sleep, but she could see he was losing the battle. "Sleep, little one," she whispered, returning to the ancient lullaby that seemed to comfort him. As her voice rose and fell with the familiar melody, she made a silent promise that cut deeper than fear, deeper than the terror of the creatures surrounding them. Whatever happened next, whatever these beings planned for her, she would not let them harm this child. The baby's breathing evened out as sleep claimed him, and with it, the protective barrier dissolved entirely. Clara found herself kneeling on broken glass with a sleeping infant in her arms, surrounded by vampires who wanted her dead and forces outside that sought the same end. But as she looked into Lucian's ancient, tormented eyes, she saw something that gave her hope. He was no longer looking at his son as a prize to be reclaimed or a bloodline to be preserved. He was looking at both of them, Clara and the baby, as something precious that needed protecting. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. This ancient king was learning to love his child by watching her love him first. The riders outside began their war chants, and Clara knew their fragile sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Clara pressed the sleeping infant closer to her chest as the war chants outside crescendoed into a thunderous roar that shook dust from the cafe's cracked ceiling. Through the shattered windows, she could see dozens of torches creating a hellish ring around the building, carried by riders whose eyes burned like stars in the storm-whipped darkness. The baby stirred against her neck, his tiny fingers clutching her shirt with desperate trust even in sleep. "The old monastery," Lucian said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos. 3 miles north, through the forest. Its walls are blessed ground. They cannot enter there. Thorn laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You would flee to human sanctuary? How far the mighty have fallen." "I would protect my son," Lucian replied, his crimson gaze never leaving Clara's face. "Something you clearly never understood." Evangeline rose from the wreckage where the baby's power had thrown her, her perfect features twisted with rage. "Run then, coward king. We will hunt you through every shadow, follow every trail, until we tear that human corruption from your heir's heart." The chanting outside stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that made Clara's skin crawl. She could feel eyes watching them through the broken windows, ancient beings deciding their fate in languages that predated civilization. The baby's protective dome had completely faded now, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Lucian moved to Clara's side with fluid grace, his hand extended toward his son. The infant's eyes fluttered open at his father's approach, those impossible crimson depths studying the vampire king with careful attention. For a moment, Clara held her breath, hoping for some sign of recognition, some spark of connection between father and child. The baby looked at Lucian for a long moment, then deliberately turned his face back toward Clara's neck, one tiny hand patting her collarbone as if to reassure himself that she remained there. The rejection was subtle but unmistakable, and Clara watched Lucian's ancient features crumble with fresh anguish. But instead of anger or wounded pride, something else flickered across the vampire king's face. Understanding, perhaps. Or acceptance of a truth he had been too proud to acknowledge. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of centuries. "He knows love," Lucian said quietly, his eyes meeting Clara's. "Something I had forgotten how to give." The first explosion shattered what remained of the cafe's front wall, sending chunks of brick and mortar flying through the air like deadly confetti. Clara threw herself over the baby, shielding him with her body as debris rained down around them. When she looked up, armored figures were pouring through the breach, their weapons gleaming with supernatural fire. "Now we run," Lucian commanded, scooping Clara and the baby into his arms with inhuman strength. The world blurred around them as he launched through the cafe's back door, moving faster than her mortal senses could process. Behind them, she heard Thorn's roar of fury and the sound of pursuit beginning. The forest swallowed them in embraces of shadow and rain, ancient trees closing ranks overhead to block out the storm-torn sky. Lucian moved between the trunks like liquid darkness, his feet barely touching the ground as he carried them deeper into the woods. Clara clutched the baby against her chest, feeling his small body trembling with each thunderous footfall of their pursuers. "The monastery," she gasped against the wind of their passage. "How do you know it will protect us?" "Faith," Lucian replied, and she heard something like surprise in his voice. Strange how one learns to value what they have spent centuries despising. Behind them, the sounds of the hunt grew louder. Howls echoed through the trees, inhuman voices raised in ancient battle songs that made the very air vibrate with power. Clara could see lights flickering between the trunks, torches and supernatural fire marking their pursuers' advance like deadly stars. The baby began to fuss against her shoulder, disturbed by the chaos and movement. Without thinking, Clara started humming the royal lullaby, her voice barely audible above the wind, but somehow carrying clearly in the supernatural silence that surrounded Lucian's movement. The infant calmed immediately, but she felt the vampire king's step falter briefly. "That song," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I sang it to him when he was born, in those few precious hours before he was taken. It was the only gift I knew how to give." Clara's heart clenched at the pain in his words. "Tell me about him, about what he was like." Lucian was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, as they leaped across a fallen log that spanned a rushing stream, he began to speak. "He was born during the eclipse, when our power runs strongest. The court expected him to emerge fully awakened, radiating the ancient hunger. Instead," Lucian's voice grew soft with wonder. "He looked at me with those eyes, so old and wise. But there was no darkness there, no thirst for blood or power, just curiosity, wonder, as if he saw something in the world worth protecting rather than conquering." The baby made a soft cooing sound, as if he recognized himself in his father's words. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were from the wind or the emotion in Lucian's voice. "The court saw it as weakness," the vampire king continued, his pace never faltering even as branches whipped past them. "They whispered that human blood had tainted our line, that he would never be the weapon they needed against the coming darkness. But watching him with you—" He paused, his grip tightening protectively around them both. "I see now that they were wrong. His power isn't diminished, it's transformed. He doesn't seek to dominate, he seeks to connect." Through the trees ahead, Clara caught a glimpse of ancient stone walls rising from the forest floor, like the bones of some great beast. The monastery loomed before them, its Gothic spires piercing the storm clouds, and she could see light glowing from within its stained glass windows. "Sacred ground," Lucian had said, "a place where even the oldest darkness could not tread." But their pursuers had gained ground during their flight. Clara could hear individual voices now, Thorne's commands cutting through the chaos like a blade, Evangeline's laughter echoing between the trees like breaking crystal. The hunt was closing in, and they still had 100 yards of open ground to cover before reaching the monastery's gates. "They're too close," Clara gasped, feeling the baby's heart racing against her ribs. Lucian's jaw tightened with determination. "Then we make our stand here." He set them down gently at the base of a massive oak, its trunk wide enough to provide some shelter from the approaching storm. The baby immediately reached for Clara, his tiny fingers gripping her shirt as if he understood the danger they faced. In the distance, she could see torches moving through the trees, growing closer with each passing second. "Take him to the monastery," Lucian commanded, turning to face their pursuers. "The moment I engage them, run. Don't look back." "What about you?" Clara asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The vampire king's smile was sad and ancient, filled with the weight of 1,000 years of regret. "I will give you time. It is the only gift I can offer my son now, the chance to grow up free from the darkness that has consumed our kind." The baby began to cry, as if he sensed what was about to happen. Clara looked down at his tear-streaked face, at the crimson eyes that held such impossible trust, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This child had claimed her heart completely in the span of a few hours, and she would not let him lose his father when they had only just found each other. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "We face this together, or not at all." Lucian stared at her in amazement. "You would risk your life for a child that isn't even your species?" I would risk everything for him, Clara replied without hesitation. Just as you would, just as you are. The first of their pursuers burst from the tree line, Thorn's armored form gleaming in the stormlight as he raised his blade toward them. Behind him came Evangeline and a dozen other court members, their eyes blazing with supernatural fury. But as they advanced across the open ground, something unexpected happened. The baby in Clara's arms began to glow again, that same crimson light that had protected them in the cafe. But this time, instead of forming a defensive barrier, the energy reached out like tendrils, connecting with something deep in the forest itself. The ancient oak above them began to shine with sympathetic light, its roots glowing beneath the earth like veins of fire. Impossible, Evangeline breathed, stopping short as the light spread from tree to tree, turning the entire forest into a web of protective energy. The child commands the very earth itself. Clara felt the power flowing through the baby, but more than that, she felt his absolute trust in her, his complete certainty that she would keep him safe. That faith was like fuel to the flames of his awakening abilities, amplifying his natural gifts into something that transcended the boundaries between species. Love, Lucian whispered in wonder. The prophecies spoke of it, but we never understood. The heir's true power isn't in domination, it's in connection. And he looked at Clara with something approaching reverence. She is the key that unlocks it. Thorn snarled and charged forward, his blade cutting through the protective light as if it were mere illusion. But as he raised his weapon to strike, Clara made a choice that would echo through both their worlds. Without hesitation, she stepped directly into his path, placing herself between the commander's blade and the child she had come to love as her own. The sword pierced her side with a flash of agony that drove her to her knees, but she never loosened her grip on the baby. Her blood spilled onto the sacred ground, and where it touched the earth, the light blazed brighter than the sun. The infant's wails of distress triggered an explosion of power that sent every attacker flying backward, their forms dissolving into shadow and mist. But Clara was falling, her strength ebbing with each heartbeat, the baby's cries growing distant as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was Lucian's face above her, his ancient eyes filled with an anguish that spanned centuries, his hands reaching desperately toward his son who wailed for the woman who had given everything to protect him. Then consciousness fled, and Clara knew nothing more. She woke in a room filled with golden light, her body wrapped in silk that felt like liquid moonbeams against her skin. The wound in her side had been healed, leaving only a thin scar that seemed to shimmer with residual magic. But more importantly, the baby was there, sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside her bed, his tiny chest rising and falling with contented breathing. "You have slept for 3 days." Lucian's voice came from the shadows beside the window. He looked different somehow, less sharp and predatory, more human. "I was beginning to fear you would not return to us." Clara struggled to sit up, her body still weak from blood loss and healing. "The monastery?" "Destroyed in the battle," Lucian said quietly. "But the sacred ground held long enough for my loyal forces to arrive. Thorn and his rebels have been dealt with. The court—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "The court has learned the true meaning of their prince's power." She looked around the room, taking in the rich tapestries and ancient stone walls. "Where are we?" "My castle." "You are—" Lucian hesitated, then smiled with something that might have been hope. "You are the official guardian of the prince now. The court voted unanimously after witnessing what happened in the forest. None dare question your right to stand at his side." Clara reached toward the cradle and the baby's eyes opened immediately at her approach. Those impossible crimson depths studied her face with such profound trust and love that tears began to flow down her cheeks. When she lifted him into her arms, he settled against her with a sigh of perfect contentment. "He calls for you in his sleep," Lucian said softly. "Not for me. Never for me. I am his father by blood, but you. He moved closer, his ancient features soft with wonder. You are his mother by choice, by love, by sacrifice. Clara looked up at this powerful creature who had learned to value compassion over conquest, who had watched his son choose a mortal woman and found beauty in that choice rather than shame. What happens now? Lucian knelt beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. Now we learn. You teach me how to love my son the way you do, without reservation, without condition. And I teach you how to navigate a world where love itself has become a revolutionary act. Through the castle's tall windows, Clara could see gardens that had been barren for centuries beginning to bloom. White and silver flowers opened to catch the moonlight, their petals glowing with the same gentle radiance that surrounded the baby in her arms. The very stones of the fortress seemed to hum with new life, as if the presence of love within its walls had awakened something that had slept too long. The prophecy spoke of healing, Lucian murmured, watching the gardens transform. Of bridges built between worlds, of darkness giving way to light. I thought it meant conquest, the triumph of our kind over yours. But watching you with my son, seeing how his power responds to your love. He shook his head in amazement. The healing was never meant to come through domination. It was meant to come through connection. Clara felt the baby's tiny hand curl around her finger, his touch warm and trusting. When she looked into his eyes, she saw not just an infant, but a bridge between worlds. A hope for something better than the ancient hatred that had divided their kinds. And in that moment, she understood that her life had been forever changed, not just by finding him, but by choosing to love him despite every rational reason to fear. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to touch the castle walls, and for the first time in 1,000 years, they brought no pain to the vampire king who stood bathed in their light. The curse that had bound his people to eternal darkness was breaking, dissolved by the simple truth that love, real, sacrificial, transformative love, was stronger than any magic, older than any prophecy, and more powerful than the accumulated weight of centuries. Clara held the baby closer and began to hum the ancient lullaby, watching as Lucian's eyes closed with something that looked remarkably like peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new bridges to build between their worlds. But today, in this moment of perfect golden light, they were simply a family. Unusual, perhaps, impossible certainly, but bound together by ties that transcended species and time itself. The baby's contentment filled the room like music, and Clara knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.